My father is living proof of what it means to settle for nothing. My father-in-law, Gerald, built an entire empire with his own two bare hands. And my dad? 60 years old, no assets, no career, clocking on for somebody else his whole life, and nothing to show for any of it. I swear to you, I will never become a man like that. My son said that, with a smirk, raising his glass in front of his wife's wealthy family. The whole table laughed along with him. His father-in-law clapped, nodding in approval. I set my fork down, slowly, and what I said next would wipe the smile off his face in under 10 seconds. My name is Arthur. I'm 63 years old, and I spent my whole working life as a welder in Sheffield, in the south of England, in the part of the world where they used to say the steel that built half the world came out of our furnaces. I never built fleets of anything. I never gave anybody a tour of a wine cellar. But I built something, and that night, at that table, I finally understood exactly what it was. Let me back up. I need to be honest with you about something before I go further. Telling this story still puts a tightness in my chest, even now, even after everything came right. Because there's a particular kind of pain that only the people you love most can hand you, and I'd never felt the full weight of it until that evening. I worked for 40 years on the tools, sparks down my collar in January, sweat through my overalls in July, double shifts on the big fabrication jobs whenever the foreman would let me have them. It was hard graft. It was honest. And for 4 decades it kept the lights on and put food on the table for me and my Margaret. Margaret was my wife. She passed 5 years ago, on an ordinary Wednesday in February, a brain hemorrhage that took her before the ambulance even reached the end of our street. She was 56. There was no warning, no long goodbye. One moment she was buttering toast and asking me whether we needed milk, and the next she was on the kitchen floor, and the whole shape of my life had cracked straight down the middle. She was gone before I could say a single thing I should have said. After the funeral I sold our terraced house in Walkley, the one we'd lived in for 24 years, and I moved into a little one-bedroom flat off Abbeydale Road. I told everyone it was because the house felt too big with just me rattling around in it. That was half the truth. The other half I kept to myself, and you'll understand why soon enough. My son is called Daniel. He's 35 now. And I'll tell you plainly, he's a clever lad, the sort who can walk into any room and make himself liked inside 2 minutes. Charming. Quick. Always knew the right thing to say. When he was small, I used to watch him and think, that boy's going further than his old man ever did, and I was glad of it. That was the whole point, wasn't it? You want them to have more than you had. 3 years after Margaret died, Daniel married a woman named Sophie. Sophie's all right. She's not warm, I won't pretend she is, but she was never cruel to me either. She's the sort who keeps a running tally of everything in her head and never lets you see the paper. It was her family that was the real story. Her father is a man called Gerald Pemberton. Now, Gerald built himself up from nothing. I'll give him that. Started with one second-hand lorry, he drove himself up and down the M1 in his 20s. And by the time Daniel married into the family, he owned a haulage firm with 60-odd vehicles, employed a couple of hundred people, and lived in a 6-bedroom pile out indoor with a heated swimming pool and a wine room he loved to show off to anybody who'd stand still long enough. His wife, Diane, was the kind of woman who'd ask what car you'd driven over in before she asked how you were keeping. They weren't wicked people. I want to be fair about that, because this story doesn't work if you think Gerald was just some pantomime villain twirling a mustache. He wasn't. He genuinely believed, right down in his bones, that the only thing that measured a man was money, that providing, in pounds and pence, was the highest form of love a person could offer. And by that measurement in his eyes, I had always come up a bit short. I need you to hold on to that, because it matters later. The dinner where it all came apart was an Easter Sunday. Daniel and Sophie had invited both families round to their place out in Bradway. I drove over in my old Vauxhall, the one with the rust starting above the rear wheel arch that I keep meaning to sort out and never do. I brought a lemon cake. Margaret's recipe, written in her own hand on a card I still keep in the drawer next to the cooker, the ink gone faint now from 40 years of fingers. When I walked in, Gerald was already holding court at the head of the table, telling some long tale about a contract he'd just landed with a supermarket distribution center. Diane was nodding along like she was watching a play she'd seen a dozen times, but still found marvelous. Daniel met me at the door with a hug. It felt a bit staged, if I'm honest. The sort of hug you give when other people are watching. The table was set with crockery I didn't recognize. Expensive stuff. The kind you'd find in one of those shops where you feel underdressed just walking past the window. And then my grandson came barreling out of the front room and wrapped himself round my leg. His name is Oliver. He's 4. He is, without a word of exaggeration, the finest person I have ever known. That was the only simple, clean moment of the whole evening. A 4-year-old who was just glad his granddad had arrived. No tally, no performance, just gladness. We sat down. Gerald said grace, which threw me, because in all the years I'd known the man, I'd never once heard him mention God anywhere outside of a dinner table. The food was good. Sophie can cook, I'll grant her that. And for the first half hour it was a perfectly ordinary Easter. Everyone on their best behavior. The talk kept safely in the shallow end. Then Gerald started in about expansion. A new depot up in Leeds. Another firm down in Derby he was thinking of buying out. And my son sat there nodding along with the glow of a man who's been thoroughly converted to somebody else's religion. Daniel's going to be running the Leeds operation, Gerald said, leaning back in his chair, once we get it up and going. I watched my son's chest swell. Sophie reached over and squeezed his hand. And I smiled, right across the table, because whatever tangled feelings I had about everything else, I was proud of him. I've always been proud of him. That's the thing nobody tells you about being a father. The pride doesn't switch off just because they hurt you. It was Diane who started it, but it was Daniel who finished it. Diane said, half to herself but not quite quiet enough, that it was just wonderful Daniel had married into a family with real drive. Real drive. She said it the way you'd say real leather, as opposed to the cheap imitation sort. And then my son, my boy, the one I taught to ride a bike in the car park behind the working men's club, running alongside him with my hand on the saddle until he shouted at me to let go. He laughed, a laugh that sounded more like Gerald's than his own, and he said, Dad's always been a bit different. He was never really built for that kind of ambition. Gerald had his first lorry on the road at 32. My dad was still clocking on for somebody else at 60. The room laughed. And I want to stop here for just a second, because I need to be honest with you about what that felt like. If you have ever sat in a room and listened to someone you would have died for turn your whole life into a punchline, then you already know. You don't shout. You don't cry. You go very, very still, and the world goes quiet, and you can hear your own heart beating in your ears like a drum in an empty hall. I heard Oliver in the next room, stacking his wooden bricks. I heard the dishwasher humming through the wall. And I heard the number I'd been carrying around in my chest for 4 years like a stone I couldn't put down. £2,800 a month, their mortgage. Another $600 a month for the loan Daniel took out to do his business diploma, the one he needed to impress Gerald enough to land the job he was now sitting there gloating about. $500 a month for Sophie's car, the lease she'd said they couldn't quite manage when the payments started. $400 for the bills. That came to £4,300 a month. £51,600 a year. For 4 years. £206,000. All of it, out of the account I set up after Margaret died. Funded by the sale of our house, by her life insurance, by 40 years of me counting every single penny. Clocking on for somebody else, I said. I said it quietly. But something in how I said it made the whole table go still. Everyone looked at me. I took a sip of water. My hand wasn't even shaking. That surprised me, looking back. Daniel, I said, I'm going to stop paying your mortgage. From next month, I'm going to stop covering Sophie's car. I'm going to stop with the bills and the loan. All of it. Gerald can take it on now. He's clearly the better provider. The silence after that was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. Diane's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Gerald sat forward, slow, in his chair. Sophie was looking at Daniel with an expression I couldn't quite read, part shock, but part something else underneath it. Something that looked almost like a question she'd been wanting to ask for a very long time. Daniel's face went through about 4 colors and settled on a careful, pale sort of blankness. Dad, he said, what are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about, son. I stood up. I took my coat off the back of the chair. I kissed the top of Oliver's head on my way past, and I walked out of the front door. I looked back once. Gerald Pemberton was staring down at the tablecloth. First time in all the years I'd known him that the man had absolutely nothing to say. Now, honestly, if that had been me sitting where one of you might be, watching your father walk out of that door, I don't know what I'd have done. I'd like to think I'd have gone after him. But the truth is, sometimes shame freezes you to your chair. And I think that's what happened to my son that night. He rang me at 10:30. I was sitting in my flat trying to read a book and not taking in a single word of it. And when I heard his voice, it was different from the dinner. Younger, somehow. Less rehearsed. "Dad," he said. "What did you mean? Earlier?" He wasn't confused about the words. He understood the words perfectly well. What he didn't understand was whether they could possibly mean what they so obviously meant. I got up and went, and stood at the kitchen counter under the light. "Your mortgage is $2,800 a month," I said. "It comes out of an account I opened after your mum died. Goes over automatically, on the 2nd of every month." He was quiet for so long I thought the line had dropped. "That's not possible," he finally said. "We pay our own mortgage. It's set up through our bank. What's the account number on your statement, Daniel?" Another long pause. "I'll have to look." "Look now." I heard a drawer open. The rustle of paper, a folder, the sound of him going through things, then nothing for the best part of 2 minutes. "Dad." His voice had changed again. "What is this account number?" "It's mine," I said. "It's been mine for 4 years. He made a sound I hadn't heard out of him since he was a teenager. Low. Unsteady. The sound of floor makes the moment before it gives way beneath you. "And the car? The loan?" "All of it. The same account. 4 years. 51,000 a year. Say the number out loud, Daniel. £206,000. He said it slowly, like he was reading it off a wall. "More or less," I said. "The house sold for a fair bit more than we paid. Your mum's insurance helped. I've been careful." He didn't say anything. I could just hear him breathing. Then I heard Sophie come into the room behind him. You can always tell, can't you, the way the sound of a room shifts when another person walks in. A whispered question from her. Daniel covered the phone for a moment. Then he came back. "Did Sophie know?" he asked. I told him I didn't believe she did. He went quiet again. And then he asked the question I'd been waiting 4 years to hear. "Did Gerald know?" And I told him the truth. I said I couldn't be certain, but I told him to think back, carefully, to all the conversations he'd had with his father-in-law when they were first sorting out their money after the wedding. To think about who suggested which accounts. To think about whether Gerald had ever once asked how 2 people on their wages kept up a house like that and a life like that. To think about whether the man had ever been strangely incurious about it. He hung up 20 minutes later. He said he needed to think. I sat back down with my book, and I didn't read a single word. 3 days went by. On the 4th, he turned up at my door without ringing first, a Wednesday morning, and I was on my 2nd cup of tea. He looked like a man who hadn't slept. Not the way you look when you're anxious, but the way you look when you've been awake, thinking, the particular exhaustion of a mind that's been working very hard on something it would much rather not look at. I let him in. He sat down at Margaret's kitchen table, the old pine one we'd brought over from Walkley, the one with the water ring from a hot pan I set down wrong in 1998 and never quite forgave myself for. He ran his hand across the surface of it, slow. "Dad," he said, "why didn't you tell me? And here's where I have to tell you about a night long before any of this. Because I sat there looking at him, and I thought about Margaret. About the night she'd sat in that very same chair, years ago, after Daniel's first engagement fell apart and left him in pieces. She'd said something to him that night that I never forgot. She said the most important thing in any life is to know what you're actually standing on, not what you think you're standing on, not what somebody's told you is there. What's actually under your feet when you look straight down. I told my son the truth I'd been telling myself for 4 years, that when he married Sophie, he'd finally seemed happy, in a way I hadn't seen in him before. Settled. And I didn't want to poison that with the weight of what I was doing. That I kept telling myself, 1 more year, just 1 more year, and he'll be established enough that they'll be properly fine on their own. That I'd been waiting for a day that just kept refusing to arrive. He looked at me for a long, long time. And then he said something I will remember until they put me in the ground. "Dad, you've been eating bread and dripping." I looked at him. "There's nothing wrong with bread and dripping," I said. "Mrs. Okonkwo down the landing told you, did she? She told me she brings you soup." Sometimes. She hadn't needed to tell him that. But Mrs. Okonkwo is 72 years old, and has absolutely no interest in keeping a secret she's decided is doing harm. I'd lost nearly 2 stone over the past 2 years. I knew it. I'd been careful not to let anyone else see it. The maths of my situation was simple enough. My pension covered the rent, the heating, the most basic shop, and not a great deal more. I'd been drawing down that account for Daniel as carefully as I could, trying to keep enough of a buffer that it wouldn't run dry before he didn't need it. Some months were tighter than others. Mrs. Okonkwo's soup, on the tight months, had been, I'll admit it now, rather more than just neighborly. My son put his face in his hands. He stayed like that a good while. And I sat across from him and said nothing at all, because there are moments when speaking is the wrong thing entirely, when silence is the only honest answer to a truth that's still settling onto a person. He looked up eventually. He told me Sophie had found the documents, that she'd sat down and really looked at their finances, properly, for the first time since the wedding, because he'd asked her to. He said when she found those account numbers she'd gone very quiet, and that the quiet was a different sort than usual. Something had shifted in it. He said she'd then spent 2 hours on the phone to her own mother without telling him a word of what they'd discussed. And he said Gerald had rung that very morning, asked if they could all meet at the weekend, said it was important, said they needed to handle this as a family. Handle this as a family. I told Daniel exactly what I thought that meant. I told him Gerald Pemberton was not a man who'd built 60 lorries by losing negotiations, that the meeting he was proposing was not a conversation. It was a settlement offer dressed up in the language of family. I told him to be careful. And Daniel said he knew. He said he'd known something for a long time that he hadn't let himself look at straight. That the job Gerald gave him had always felt a touch too convenient. The salary a touch too neatly matched to their lifestyle. The promised promotions always somehow just out of reach, conditional in ways he could never quite put his finger on. He said he'd chosen not to see it, because seeing it would have meant asking himself a question he wasn't ready to answer, which was, what exactly had he built, and who had actually built it? Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. He set it down on Margaret's table, between us. Property records, he said, company filings. Gerald's firm had turned over £3.5 million the previous year. Sophie's brother, who worked for the company, was on 150,000. Daniel's own salary, which Gerald had always presented as terribly generous, was 55,000. And the family trust, the one Gerald had mentioned a dozen times as being tied up, locked away, impossible to touch, had been paying out £25,000 a quarter for the past 3 years. To Gerald, personally. I looked at the numbers. Daniel watched me look at them. His father-in-law had been quietly drawing £100,000 a year from a trust he'd told everyone was inaccessible while letting my retirement savings fund his own daughter's lifestyle, while sitting at every family dinner and soaking up the story that he was the successful one, and I was the one who'd just never had the drive to build anything. There was a watch, Daniel said. He'd found a receipt in Gerald's desk. A jeweler in London. £31,000. Bought 14 months earlier, the very same month their boiler had packed in. And Daniel had mentioned to Gerald, almost in passing, that the repair quote was more than they'd budgeted for. And Gerald had told him not to worry. Said he'd make sure it was sorted. 3 days later, the boiler was fixed. Daniel had thanked him. He hadn't known the money had come from me. I got up and walked to the window that looks out over the car park behind my building. Mrs. Okonkwo's little car was down there. An old green thing, far older than a woman her age ought to be driving alone, but she is fiercely uninterested in anybody's concern. I'd fixed the wing mirror on it back in October. She'd brought me up a pot of jol of rice that could have fed 6 men. This is the economy of people who don't have trust funds. You fix a wing mirror. You get a pot of rice. Nobody keeps a tally on paper because the tally is just kindness, going round and round. Daniel came and stood next to me at the window. He said he was sorry. And I told him what I actually meant, which was this, that I wasn't angry with him, the way he was so frightened that I was, that I understood how a person can choose not to see a thing that would cost too much to look at, that his mother had told me something very similar once, about her own family, years back, that looking straight at a hard truth isn't something we're born able to do. It's something we have to decide to do. And I told him I thought he'd finally decided. He asked me what came next. I told him that was his decision, not mine. He had a son. He had a marriage that, by his own account, was now standing on completely different ground than it had been a week before. He had a job at a company owned by a man who'd spent 4 years treating my pension like a line on a family budget he'd never bothered to mention. Those were the facts. What he did with them was up to him. He said he needed a week. I told him to take whatever he needed. The meeting at Gerald's house was the following Saturday. I drove out to Door in the old Vauxhall. The sweeping gravel drive, the triple garage, the sort of garden that needs a hired team rather than a Sunday afternoon with a trowel. I'd been to that house a dozen times for one family occasion or another, and I'd always felt that particular smallness that grand houses are sometimes built to make a visitor feel. I didn't feel it that day. Gerald had set the living room up like a boardroom. He sat in the big chair by the fireplace. Diane was on the sofa. Sophie sat beside her, and Daniel was standing over by the window. He caught my eye when I walked in. He looked like a man who'd made up his mind and wasn't going to be shifted off it. Gerald stood and offered me his hand. I shook it, because I'm 63 years old, and I was raised to shake a hand offered in good faith, even when I have my doubts about the faith. He started by thanking me, on behalf of the family, for the support I'd provided over the years. He said it the way men like him say everything, in a tone built to make you feel that being acknowledged is the same thing as being made whole. He said there'd perhaps been a bit of miscommunication about the nature of the arrangement, that these things happen in families, that the important thing now was to find a way forward that worked for everyone. Miscommunication, I said. Gerald looked at me. A miscommunication would be if one of us thought we were talking about one thing, and it turned out we were talking about another. This wasn't that, Gerald. You knew exactly what you were talking about. Diane shifted on the sofa. Sophie was staring at the carpet. Gerald's face moved through a whole series of quick calculations. He said very carefully that he'd always understood the arrangement to be temporary and voluntary, that he'd never once pressured me in any direction, that he had simply allowed me to express my love for my son in the way I'd chosen. I looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at his father-in-law. You allowed me, I said. You allowed a man who was eating one meal a day to pay for your daughter's life, while you bought yourself a 31,000-pound watch and told my son your trust was locked away. Gerald, I have never once in my life used that word aloud about something I was quietly doing for someone who trusted me. Sophie stood up. She said, Mum. And Diane stood, and the two of them left the room together. And Gerald and Daniel and I sat there in the silence that was left. Gerald was looking at his hands. Daniel was looking at Gerald. And then my son said, I'm resigning, Gerald. Gerald's head came up fast. Daniel, don't be hasty. This is a hard moment for everyone. I've been building towards something here, towards your partnership, towards a real future for you in this business. The company's yours one day. Yours and Sophie's. You know that. I know what you told me, Daniel said. And I know what you didn't tell me. And I know that a job built on my father's pension is not something I can stand in and still look at myself in the mirror. The room was very quiet. And I thought about Margaret. I thought about how she'd told me once that the most important thing she ever saw me do was apologize to a customer for a job that wasn't even my fault, simply because I thought somebody ought to, and nobody else was going to. She said that was the moment she understood exactly who she'd married. I'd never told Daniel that story. Sitting in that room, I wished I had. Gerald made 2 more attempts to bend the situation back into a shape he could live with. Both failed. The second one was the worst. It was an oblique little mention of Oliver, of the importance of a stable home, of what all this upheaval might mean for a 4-year-old. And Daniel said, with a steadiness I hadn't expected, and that went somewhere very deep in me, that Oliver was exactly the reason he was doing this, because he refused to raise his son in a house built on a lie. Sophie came back into the room then, on her own. She sat down on the sofa not next to her father, but right at the far end of it, and she looked at Daniel. She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at me. Arthur, she said, I'm sorry. I want you to know I didn't know. Her voice was steady. I believed her, and I told her I did. She said she and Daniel had talked for most of the last 4 nights. She said she'd asked her father directly, twice, and that what he'd said and what he hadn't said had told her everything she needed to know. She said she wasn't going to pretend she yet understood what her marriage needed to look like going forward, but that she wasn't going to pretend the last 4 years had been anything other than exactly what they were. And Gerald's face was the face of a man who has finally understood that the whole structure he spent a lifetime building has shifted, in a single afternoon, into something that can never be put right again. Now I want to be fair to Gerald, even here, because I think, in his own way, In the cracked logic of the world he'd built for himself, he believed he was being generous the whole time. He'd given my son a job. He'd given his daughter a beautiful house. In his mind, providing was loving, and the rest was just sensible management of his own affairs. That's the tragedy of a man like that. He wasn't lying to us so much as he was lying to himself, and he'd been doing it so long he couldn't tell the difference anymore. That's what the love of money does to a person. It doesn't make them a monster. It makes them blind. Daniel and I left together. We stood by our cars on that gravel drive. He asked me what I was going to do now. I told him I was going to go home, have a shower, and ring Mrs. Okonkwo to see if she wanted me to take a look at her passenger wing mirror, which had been hanging loose since February. He laughed, a real laugh, the first one I'd heard out of him in a week that didn't have something strained underneath it. And then he said, "Dad, I need to tell you about a conversation I had on Tuesday." He'd been to see a solicitor, an old friend from his diploma course who'd gone into family and civil law. The solicitor had looked over everything Daniel brought him, the records of the payments I'd made, the gap between Gerald's stated income and the life the family had actually been living, the evidence of those trust distributions. And he'd said that while it was complicated, there were grounds to go after recovery of a portion of the money, particularly given that Gerald had actively helped conceal the arrangement from Daniel, had directly benefited from it, and had made material misrepresentations about the family's finances throughout the marriage. It would take time, the solicitor said. It would need Daniel's cooperation and Sophie's own decision about where she stood. It wouldn't be the full 206,000. But his early estimate, based on what he'd seen, was that somewhere between 70 and 90,000 pounds was realistic if they pursued it through the civil courts, and that Gerald's solicitors would very likely far prefer to settle the whole thing quietly long before it ever got that far. I looked at my son on that gravel drive. He looked more like himself than he had in a very long time. He looked like the boy who'd helped me rewire a fuse board in the cellar in Walkley when he was 14 and decided by the end of it that he wanted to understand how everything in the world worked. I told him it was his call. He said he knew. He said he was going to do it. And he said whatever I chose to take back was mine. And whatever I chose not to take, he'd hold in trust for Oliver's education so that Oliver would go to university one day on money that belonged to the family that actually loved him. That was 7 months ago. Daniel and Sophie are in a 2-bedroom rented place in Hillsborough now, close to a school Oliver starts in September. Sophie's gone back to working part-time at a dental surgery, something she'd done before the marriage and given up when Gerald made it clear he thought it beneath them. She seems different now, steadier, like a woman who was told a long story about herself and has finally decided to write her own. They're in counseling, the two of them. Daniel told me that without a flicker of embarrassment, which I respected enormously. He said it was hard and it was useful, which is exactly what I'd expect. The legal business settled out of court 11 weeks ago, £78,000. It's sitting in an account. I haven't decided yet what to do with most of it. I did do one thing. I drove out to the old house in Walkley, the one Margaret and I lived in for 24 years. The new owners have painted the front door a color we'd never have chosen. The little patch where Margaret planted her bulbs every autumn is gone, paved over now. But the cherry tree in the back garden is still there. The one Daniel fell out of when he was 9 and broke his wrist and only cried a little because he was trying so hard to be brave. And Margaret had knelt down and said to him, "You don't have to be brave with us, love. We're your mum and dad." I sat in the car outside that house for a good while. I wasn't sad exactly. I was the particular kind of quiet that comes over you after something long and heavy has finally been set down. And here's what I want to leave you with, before I go. Because this whole thing taught me something, and I'd be keeping the best of it back if I didn't pass it on. This taught me that the mistake most people make is they measure their worth by the thing the loudest person in the room is measuring it by. They let somebody else hold the ruler. And what my son finally understood, what nobody else at that Easter table understood, least of all Gerald, was that a life isn't the house, or the cars, or the watch. It's what you're standing on when you look straight down. It's whether the ground is real. So here's what I'd ask you to do today. Just one thing. Most people who carry others do it in silence, and they go their whole lives assuming nobody ever noticed. Be the person who noticed. Say it out loud. Don't wait 4 years like my son did. Don't wait until you're standing in a driveway and it's almost too late. And here's a question I'd like you to sit with, quietly, after this finishes. When you measure your own life, when you take stock of whether you've done well, whose ruler are you using? Is it yours? Or is it someone else's, handed to you so long ago you've forgotten it was ever placed in your hand? Now I'd love to hear from you, because these stories only travel as far as you carry them. Tell me in the comments. Type a 1 if you think I was right to do what I did at that table. Type a 2 if you think I should have told my son the truth years earlier. Or type a 3 if you think I should have just kept the secret and let him believe what he believed. There's no wrong answer. I genuinely want to know how you see it. And tell me where in the world you're watching from, and what the time is where you are right now. Because I love seeing just how far one story can reach. And if you've ever been the one quietly holding someone up, or the one who found out too late that someone was holding you, tell me. I read these. They mean more to me than you know. If this story touched something in you, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe before you go. It's just me here, telling these stories one at a time, and every single subscriber tells me to keep going. So if you'll have me, I'd love to have you here for the next one. Stay well, look after the people holding you up, and I'll see you again soon. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Sheffield to create original content.